welcome everybody. And as I said, this is Vashon Heritage Museum History Talks. I'm Elsa Kronquist, the Executive Director of the museum. Today's talk is the history of the Vashon Bridge. And this is in partnership. We do these talks with the Vashon Senior Center. And also I want to say a big thank you to our sponsor, For Culture. So now let's introduce our speaker, who you already know. Dr. Bruce Hallman is a retired professor of history from Green River College, the author of A Brief History of Vashon, a Vashon resident, and the current president of the Vashon Island Heritage Association. Dr. Hallman, whoops, I lost something here. Dr. Hallman tells us today about John Cherberg and his role in making one of the most important decisions in Vashon history, whether or not to build the Vashon Bridge. I'm not going to give the ending away about what the decision was. Bruce, could you talk to us about the Vashon, it's called the Vashon Cross Sound Bridge?
Yes.
And was it built?
It was not built.
Oh, okay.
We'll go to the end at the beginning, but yes, no, it was not built. But what you are looking at here is actually an Achille Curtis photograph of the Lake Washington floating bridge when it was first built in 1940. And it's a sort of a model for what the Vashon Bridge would have looked like, at least the part from Fauntleroy over to the top end of Vashon Island. And then there would have been a high level bridge from Vashon over to Southworth, much like the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. So it was really a two-part bridge, one from Fauntleroy to Vashon that would have been a floating bridge, very much like the Lake Washington floating bridge and the Hood Canal floating bridge, and then a high level bridge over to the Kitsap Peninsula. So what you're seeing here is the bridge that was built in 1940 to Mercer Island. And what I want to talk about today is a little bit about how similar Vashon and Maury and Mercer Island were in the 1920s and 30s, and how the bridge radically changed the way the two islands developed. And to do that, I want to sort of go through three kinds of things. I want to look at Vashon from the 1920s into the 1950s, when the decision to not build the bridge was made. And then I want to compare Vashon and Mercer Island from the 1920s to the present, so you can see the impact of the bridge. And then recognize what I call Vashon hero GOAT, the greatest of all time Vashon heroes, John Cherberg. So that's sort of the structure of what I want to do today. And with that, let me get started, except I want to mention too that this floating bridge was very innovative. A guy named, let's see, Homer Hadley was the engineer who designed this bridge. He worked for the Portland Cement Association, and it was his concept to build these sort of hollow floating cement structures that became the floating bridge. There's an interesting connection to Vashon with Homer Hadley. His concrete designs and sort of the idea of these hollow sort of columns is what designed the Judd Creek Bridge that you drive across every day when you drive down Vashon Highway. And it's a state landmark because it was one of the first to use that construction technique for a bridge like the Judd Creek Bridge. So the guy who designed the Lake Washington Bridge also designed our Judd Creek Bridge. So we have a connection to the bridge, even though we don't have a floating bridge. So let me pop into Vashon in the 1920s. And Vashon in the 1920s, if you look at this map, it's really fascinating to see each of those red stars represent either a steamer dock, so a mosquito fleet dock, and there were 32 of them around the island. There's 3 ferry docks. There's one at the north end at Vashon Heights, one at the south end at Telecoil, the 2 that we have now. And there was a 3rd at Portage, sort of right near where the fishing pier is, the closed fishing pier. There was a ferry route there, a ferry dock there, that ran from Portage to Des Moines. So in 1920, Vashon had probably the best ferry service we've ever had. You know, we had 32 steamer docks, we had mosquito fleet boats running to Seattle and Tacoma, we had 3 ferry docks, we had service to downtown Seattle, service to Seattle, Tacoma, and to Des Moines. So it was really a fascinating time for Vashon. But the 1920s is sort of the peak, and between 1920 and 1960, so that 30-year period of the 20s, 30s, 40s into the 50s, when Vashon Bridge was not built in the late 1950s, its decision to not build the bridge was made, is a time of transition. Ferry service transitions from all being privately owned in 1920, except for the Vashon Portage Des Moines route, which was a King County route. All the other ferry service to the island and most of the ferry service in Puget Sound was privately owned. By the 1950s, they're all publicly owned. They're all state ferries. It's also a transition of time from mosquito fleet ferries. So the very first car ferry on Puget Sound was the Portage Des Moines ferry in 1916. But essentially, almost all of the ferries in the early 1920s are passenger-only ferries, mosquito fleet boats. By the 1950s, there's no mosquito fleet left. And finally, it's sort of the consolidation that takes place. If you look at this map and you look at those red stars, everybody in the island virtually lived within walking distance of a ferry dock. Today, we've consolidated down and we just have 2 ferry docks, one at the north end, one at the south end. So it's a time of real transition. Now, what was that transition? In part, it really started in the 1930s. So what you have here is a photograph taken in 1939 aboard the ferry Elwha. This is Elmer Harmerling, who was one of the owners of what would be the Alibi restaurant in downtown Vashon, cooking a meal for a group of sit-in strikers who took over the ferry Elwha in 1939 in an attempt to prevent the ferry from not serving Vashon Island. They didn't want the ferry to leave and not come back. Because what had happened in the 1930s, you have to remember, the 1930s is a period of the Great Depression. It's a period of labor strikes and labor conflicts all over the United States. And beginning in 1933 was the beginning of a series of ferry strikes that disrupted ferry service and ultimately led to the creation of a Vashon Ferry District and then ultimately the Washington State Ferry System. So in 1933, there's the first strike. 1934, there's a Memorial Day strike, so appropriate. We're just getting ready to go into the Memorial Day weekend. COVID has kind of closed down our Memorial Day, but you can imagine in the 1930s, ferry systems being shut down because of strikes right before the Memorial Day weekend. It disrupted people's vacation plans, travel plans. So the strikes were very, very carefully timed to sort of have maximum impact. In 1935, there was a 33-day ferry strike. No ferry service for 33 days. 1936, there was a 15-day ferry strike, and that led to the creation of a statewide, sort of a Puget Sound-wide Ferry Service Improvement Association that began to push for state ownership of the ferries so that there would not be ferry strikes. 1937 was an interesting strike, again, Memorial Day weekend. King County actually brought on one of their ferries because King County ran service across Lake Washington. They took a ferry from Lake Washington, bought it out, and ran service to Vashon Island. So the county was intervening to take the place of private ferries, and that set a precedent that you'll see in just a few minutes when we get to it. And then 1939, this was a Memorial Day strike that went on for 22 days. in August, so this picture is taken in August. In August, there was supposed to be another strike called. And so before the strike began, 33 Vashon Islanders went down when the Elwha came into the dock at the north end. 33 Islanders went on and occupied the ferry. Now, the ferry actually pulled out and went to Harper over by Southworth for the night. These guys went with the ferry to make sure that it came back to Vashon. And so this is Elmer Harmeling cooking a meal for those sit-in strikers in 1939. Being very interesting, sort of typical Vashon Islanders, the next morning, the insurance company for the ferry owner, because it was a privately owned ferry, asked them to leave because they couldn't be covered by the insurance. And so they left and came back to Vashon Island. So kind of a typical Vashon nice, if you will, kind of thing. But it's interesting because this group really establishes the concept of the Vashon vigilantes that will come up later in the 1940s, where Vashon Islanders are very willing to take action to control their own ferry destiny. And after World War II, so there's kind of a sort of a pause in ferry strikes and ferry actions during World War II. There was agreements between the unions and the operators that they would not change fares, they would not change pay rates, there would be no strikes to support the war effort. But after World War II, of course, the owners of the private ferries began to ask for fare increases. The unions began to strike to make up wages that were lost during the war, or wages that were not increased during the war. And so there began a struggle to create a Vashon ferry district, essentially, when these strikes began to occur in 1947. Vashon Islanders were sort of fed up enough that they pushed through, and other islands in Puget Sound, pushed through the state legislature in 1947, a bill that allowed counties to organize special ferry districts. And so when there was a strike in March 1947 that shut the ferries down again for almost a month, what Vashon Islanders did is they went and created to King County and asked for the creation of King County Ferry District number 1. And in September, they took it to the island as a vote, and it was approved 316 to 38 to create a special ferry district for Vashon Island. And so what was created was a Vashon Ferry District. And the Vashon Ferry District sort of took over some ferries loaned to them by King County. This is the Lincoln of Kirkland. This was a ferry that ran across Lake Washington. Remember, the Lake Washington Bridge was built in 1940, so these ferries were not needed on Lake Washington. So they were available, and the county gave a couple to the Vashon Ferry District. Vashon Ferry District purchased another couple ferries, and between, let's see, I'm trying to think the dates now, but between 1947, well, 1948 actually, when they first created it, to 1951, Vashon ran our own ferry district. And like any ferry district, it had its problems, but it was run by islanders. But what it led to ultimately was the reappearance of the Vashon vigilantes. When Peabody, who owned the Blackball fleet, which was a privately owned monopoly of ferries in Puget Sound, wanted to serve Vashon Island because King County had actually, or the state had actually allowed him to run a ferry from Southworth to Fauntleroy. Well, he wanted to stop at Vashon. And so when he wanted to stop at Vashon, he announced that he would start ferry service. And so what islanders did was gathered together. Vashon vigilantes went down to the North End dock. When the Peabody ferry tried to pull into the dock, they prevented it. They had axe handles, they had poles, they pushed the ferry off. They would not allow the ferry to come in. And it protected the Vashon Ferry District, and it established this sort of idea of the Vashon vigilantes, the island willing to sort of step up and do what is necessary to protect its own ferry system. What we see while the ferry system is going on is this incredible struggle going on between the state of Washington and Captain Peabody how to serve Puget Sound. And this is really the struggle that in 1948, 49, and 50 led ultimately to the creation of the Washington State Ferry System. So the Governor Walgren, who was a staunch opponent of Captain Peabody, and Captain Peabody was one of these sort of what you would call almost a sort of a rampant capitalist who sort of, ferry service has to be private, it's my business, I can do anything I want with it kind of thing. And so the two were in a real titanic struggle over whether the state would buy his ferry system or not. Walgren actually negotiated purchase, but that was turned over by the state Supreme Court, and so the purchase did not go through. The following year, Walgren lost the election to Governor Langley. Governor Langley pushed the bill through the legislature that would allow the state to buy the blackball system. And so what happened in 1950 is that actually the Washington State bought the blackball fleet and created the Washington State Ferry System. So this is sort of the bill of sale. This comes out of a book done by HistoryLink about the ferries of Puget Sound. So for $4.9 million, the state of Washington bought all of the blackball ferries. They bought all of the routes. The one route that they didn't buy is the Port Angeles Victoria route that is still run by the blackball ferries. But all the rest of the routes in Puget Sound. And they went out and they leased terminals that were not owned by blackball. They bought some additional ferries from King County, and they created the Washington State Ferry System in 1951. Now, for most of us, we think the ferry system is a pretty sort of permanent thing. But in reality, the ferry system was going to be temporary. The idea was that we would have a ferry system for a few years until a series of cross sound bridges were built. And so the idea, what you see here are the three central Puget Sound bridges. There was already the bridge at Tacoma Narrows. There were going to be these three bridges, one at Vashon, one at the south end of Bainbridge, and one at the north end of Bainbridge. There was going to be another another bridge from across to Apple Tree Cove, and then there was going to be another bridge up at Port Townsend. So there were going to be, what, 7 bridges across Puget Sound? It's a pretty interesting sort of idea. And of course, it ran into opposition very early on. But the concept was that the ferry system would only be temporary and that it would soon be replaced by these cross sound bridges. And that, of course, leads us into the Vashon Bridge. What you see here, this is in 1950. This is the Garden Club sort of centerpiece at the flower show. And what it is a depiction of the high-level bridge across Cobos Passage of the Vashon Bridge. And so what you see in the early 1950s is there's actually a fair amount of support on the island for the creation of a bridge. You know, a lot of business people, farmers, you know, islanders in general were largely supportive of the island in the early 1950s. There were some significant people who did not want a bridge, who saw it as fundamentally changing the nature of the island. But the plan for the bridge and the plans around developing the bridge were fairly fascinating. They called for the island population. What they predicted was the island population would grow by 1970 to 50,000 people. Now, we have 11,000 people in 2020, basically. So you can imagine the island being virtually 5 times more densely populated than it is now. There was going to be, on the north end of Maury Island, it was going to be an industrial area, so a development for industrial parks. There were going to be I think 7 grammar schools, 3 middle schools, and 4 high schools. So it was sort of this idea of Vashon was going to become a highly developed suburb of Seattle. And of course, it was largely supported by Islanders in the early 50s. When you look through the papers, when you read the articles, every once in a while, a letter about, well, this bridge is going to change the island, and it would have changed the island. But the opposition was not very strong at that time. It grew during the 1950s and 1960s, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Now, the Vashon Bridge itself, what's fascinating about this bridge, when you look at it, this is sort of the distillation down from having 3 cross sound bridges right in central Puget Sound to just having 1 at Vashon. And if you notice, there's a bridge here that, let me see, yeah, there's a bridge here. There's a floating bridge that comes from Brace Point, just south of Fauntleroy, over to Dolphin Point, goes across the island, a high level bridge like the Tacoma Narrows Bridge over to Southworth. And then the highway would take you up to a high level bridge across Rich Passage onto Bainbridge, and then across in a high level bridge across Sinclair Inlet into Bremerton. So this was going to be the major avenue for people to get from Seattle to the Kitsap Peninsula, to Bremerton, to Bainbridge Island. And of course, with this development, the ferries would disappear. Now, another fascinating piece of this is the Vashon Parkway. So if this bridge had been built, if you look up here at the top of Vashon Island, you see these 2 little red circles. Whoops, there we go. When I move this, it does that sometimes. You'll notice 2 circles up at the north end of Vashon Island. Those are interchanges. And so the idea was that the bridge would be traffic crossed. There would be an interchange that would take you onto the red highway that's essentially the existing Vashon Highway. But then there was going to be a Vashon Parkway, a limited access 4-lane highway that would come right down the center of Vashon Island down to just south of Shawnee and essentially bypass the town of Vashon Island. Now you can imagine what Vashon would be like if we had a 4-lane highway running down the middle of the island and if we had a bridge at the north end. Now, why wasn't the bridge built? This to me is one of the most interesting parts of the story, is that there was a lot of pressure to have the bridges built. There was also a lot of opposition. So the state legislature had passed approvals to build the bridge numerous times during the 1950s. And it came down to 1959 when the bridge had passed the House, an appropriations bill had passed the House to build the bridge, and had passed by large majorities, but then went to the Senate. And in the Senate, it was more closely fought because a number of opposition to the bridge came from Eastern Washington legislators who didn't see the need to spend all that money for a bridge in Western Washington. And also from legislators in Tacoma and on the Kitsap Peninsula who didn't want the bridge across Vashon from Tacoma's point of view because it would interfere with boat traffic down to the port of Tacoma, and from Kitsap County and Bainbridge who didn't want the bridge on Vashon but wanted the bridge on Bainbridge Island. So when it comes to the Senate, it comes up to a vote, and it's essentially a tie vote. And so it comes to John Cherberg, who is the lieutenant governor, and you know, in Washington State, the lieutenant governor is the president of the Senate, so he's the sort of deciding vote. Well, the bill from the lower house, House of Representatives, had been changed by the Senate, and so Cherberg in this tie vote had this sort of decision to make of whether to send the bill back to a committee, back to the Highway Committee, to be reconsidered and then bring back to the floor, or to allow it to go to a vote. Well, the Senate had changed the bill So Cherberg, as sort of the deciding vote, decided to send it back to the Highway Committee. Well, the Highway Committee was controlled by people from Kitsap Peninsula in Eastern Washington. So if the bill went back to the Highway Committee, it would be bottled up and would die. And other legislators understood that. So what they did is they brought the bill to the floor and asked for a sort of a decision from the House whether or not to override Cherberg's decision or not. And it went to a vote, and the vote to send it to the committee prevailed by 28 to 21. So John Cherberg, in his sort of standing up for his principles and sort of understanding sort of the importance of this bill to fund the bridge, by sending it back to committee, essentially killed the bridge, and the bridge was never built. So that decision in 1959 and John Cherberg's decision to stand up for his principles and for his understanding and his reading of sort of the way the legislature worked really saved Vashon from having a bridge. Now, you jump forward to 1992, and this is just a wonderful poster done by Nancy Silver. In 1992, the State Highway Commission proposed to reopen the consideration of a bridge to Vashon Island and had public hearings. And in 1992, had a hearing on Vashon Island in which over 3,000 islanders showed up. So this is a time when you can imagine, the population of Vashon Island is about 9,000 or so. So nearly a third of islanders show up for this meeting. And it's just almost universally sort of expressed that we do not want a bridge on Vashon Island. And I think this image from Nancy Silver's poster is a good example of what that was. And so essentially that began to shut down the Highway Commission's idea of a bridge. It's still there, it still could come back, but the cost continues to go up. And so I don't think anytime in the near future we'll see the construction of a Vashon Bridge. So what was the impact? It's interesting to think about Vashon Island and Mercer Island. Vashon almost had a bridge. Mercer Island had a bridge. And when you look at how those islands developed from the 1920s to the present, you get a sense of what might have happened on Vashon Island if we had had a bridge. So you can see Mercer Island in Lake Washington, Vashon Island in Puget Sound. And let's take a look at these islands in the 1920s. So you've seen this map on the left. This is the road map and the ferry docks on Vashon Island. Vashon Island is nearly 37 square miles, 2,800 people in 1920, and 32 steamer docks, 3 ferry docks. Mercer Island at that time in 1920, 13 square miles, so a third of the size of Vashon. Similar population, 2,500, 13 docks. And if you look up, if I can do this without flipping the slide, that little red line there, that's a bridge built in the early 1920s between the mainland and Bellevue and Mercer Island. So by the 1920s, Mercer Island has a bridge connecting it to the east side. If you look at this next slide, and this is a little hard to sort of see. These are aerial photos. These were done by the Army Corps of Engineers in 1941 and actually printed in 1944, but they were part of the effort to sort of map Puget Sound by aerial survey in preparation for World War II. Now, when you look at Vashon, you notice there's a forested area up here where Shingle Mill Creek is. There's a forested area here where Island Center Forest is. There's forested areas down here near Telecoil, forested areas here on Maury Island and in the center here where Docton and Glacier Pit are. But the rest of Vashon is open land for farming. It's not highly developed in terms of housing, but it is developed in terms of it's largely open. And this in 1940, there's 3,118 people on Vashon. And Mercer Island in 1940, if you look at this, I mean, this whole area of the south end of the island is very heavily forested. There's not a lot of development. There's some agricultural development up here at the north end of the island. There's a small sort of Vashon, Mercer Island, town of Mercer Island. But that population of Mercer Island had dropped because of the agricultural depression of the 1920s and 1930s. A large population had moved off of Mercer Island, but not off of Vashon Island. Now, if you look at the two islands today, these are aerial photographs from 2017. You can look at Vashon, still heavily forested here. Forest areas have grown where there were largely fields. Now there's forest taking over. This whole area in here is largely forested. So Vashon has sort of reverted to a tree cover. Mercer Island in 2017, there's this patch of sort of park and forest land here. There's a patch of area where it's very steep cliffs along here, some park areas up here, but Mercer Island is almost universally developed. And the population of Vashon in 2020 census, 10,624. For Mercer Island, it's 24,326. So what you see is a significant sort of change in these islands between 1920 and 2017. And my sense, and it's pretty clear, it's this bridge. It's the bridge that opens up Mercer Island and changes Mercer Island. And you can really see that if you look at this next slide. This is the population of Vashon and Mercer Island from the 1920s up to the projected population in 2017. And so you see the island in 1920 essentially starting at about the same place, 2,800 on Vashon, 2,500 on Mercer Island. In 1940, Vashon has grown slightly. Mercer Island has lost population, but the bridge is built in 1940. By 1950, after the end of World War II, Vashon has grown slightly, 3,800, 3,900 basically. Mercer Island has jumped significantly, 4,500. But then look at the decade of the 1950s and the 1960s. So by 1960, Vashon's continuing to grow relatively slowly, 5,000 population. Mercer Island has jumped by 3 times to 12,000. By 1970, 6,500 on Vashon, almost 20,000 on Mercer Island. And then in the 1980s and 90s, the Vashon population continues to grow, but relatively slowly, 7,000, 9,000, 10,000, and then by 2000, 2010, 2017, the growth is very, very slow. And right now projections are in 2017, 10,400, so a slight drop. Not sure I agree with that. And the 2020 census will give us some sense of it. But if you look at Mercer Island in 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010, 2017, relatively slow growth. There's not a lot of area to grow in Mercer Island. And so where Mercer Island is growing is largely in multifamily and in apartments and condos and that kind of thing, which you don't see on Vashon Island. So an interesting impact that a bridge made on these two islands. And if you look at it in terms of why, Vashon has remained in unincorporated King County. We have no bridge. Mercer Island gets its first bridge in 1923, the East Channel Bridge. In 1940, the Lacey Morrow Bridge is built, the floating bridge. In 1960, actually, the town of Mercer Island incorporates and the city of Mercer Island incorporates. So the business district incorporated as the city of Mercer Island. The rest of the island incorporated as the town of Mercer Island. So there were two municipal governments for 10 years on Mercer Island, and then they finally merged in 1970. Well, what that did is it sort of changed the structure. You had a city council that was making decisions about police, about fire, about zoning, about building construction. I mean, all of those kind of things. Whereas Vashon Island stays as part of King County. And there's some indication that King County has some interest in keeping Vashon development sort of restrained. We're one of the unincorporated areas of King County. Under the Growth Management Act, King County can push growth into areas that are already developed, keep Vashon more rural, and it helps them meet their goals under the state sort of Development Act. So Vashon has remained very rural. Mercer has become very urban. And then in 1989, the second Mercer Island Bridge is built, the Homer Hadley Memorial Bridge. They name it after Homer Hadley, the engineer who designed the first floating bridge. And so what you get today, this is Mercer Island today. You have on the right, the original Morrow Bridge, and Morrow was the brother of Edward R. Morrow, the broadcaster. And then on the right, you have the Homer Hadley Bridge. So you look at that, you've got what, 8 lanes of traffic going across Lake Washington or Mercer Island. Vashon Island, this is our bridge. You know, we still have the Washington State ferry system, and love it or hate it, it's one of the reasons Vashon has not become Mercer Island. That and the greatest of all time Vashon hero, Lieutenant John Cherberg, who had the sort of moral courage to stand up and sort of say, no, this is the way the rules are meant to work. We're going to have them work that way. And in doing that, really prevented the Vashon Bridge from passing the legislature. It was killed in committee. It never came back. It was never passed. And so Vashon never got a bridge. So this is what we could have had, but what we have now is the Vashon ferries. So quick overview. If there are any questions, Liz, do you want to help handle questions?
Sure, I got a couple here for you, Bruce.
Okay, sure.
The first question that came in has to do with an attendee who was in the high school gym in 1992 when the engineers proposed the Tacoma Narrows bridge concept.
Yep.
And his question is, do you think the 1992 bridge alternative was any more than a straw man alternative that was meant to fail so the Tacoma Narrows alternative could be built?
Yeah, I mean, you hear that, and it's, my sense is yes and no. Yes, it was a part of the state highway department push to sort of say, hey, let's fund this second bridge at the Tacoma Narrows. And the idea that there wouldn't be a bridge on Vashon and there was such an opposition from Vashon helped make that an easier sell. On the other hand, the deep state, if you will, state bureaucracies, plans never go away. And at some point, a bridge to Vashon Island is going to make sense. Now, hopefully not in our lifetime, but at some point, the ferry system is going to become more and more difficult to sustain. And so my sense at some point, if we ever get to that point, I'm not sure we will, but if we do, we'll see a bridge, either at Vashon or at Bainbridge. The problems are the Sound is a much more difficult body of water to bridge than even Lake Washington. And of course, Lake Washington, the bridge sank, and the Mercer Island Bridge sank. I mean, the Hood Canal Bridge sank. So floating bridges have their own problems. And so whether or not we'll ever see a bridge to Vashon, I'm not sure, but those plans are still there. Plans never go away.
And as we know, no plan survives first contact.
Exactly.
especially when you're contacting Vashon Islanders.
Yes.
So we have another question around that, and somebody wants to know, Greg wants to know, why did the proposed Parkway end at Shawnee rather than continue to Telecoil?
You know, I've never been able to sort of suss that out from the writings and from the plans. To me, it just did not make a whole lot of sense, other than that south end of Vashon, from sort of the Telecoil Y south, has never been heavily populated. And my sense is they were going to tie into the existing Vashon Highway at that point, and then that would take you down to the Telecoil Ferry Dock. But you know, it sort of doesn't make sense. If you're going to build a freeway, why not build it all the way to Telecoil? And then if you had bridges, you know, people could drive from Seattle to Telecoil, catch a 15-minute ferry ride across, and they'd be in Tacoma, probably quicker than driving down I-5.
Mm-hmm.
But I've never found anything that clarifies why they stopped it there.
Uh-huh. So somebody wrote that he thought the Coast Guard and the Port of Tacoma were opposed
Yes, right.
because it impeded access of ocean-going ships.
Yep. Yeah. There was a number of opponents to the bridge. One was the Port of Tacoma was a very strong opponent because they thought it would impact their traffic coming in. Actually the Pilots Association, so the people who drive the big ships up and down Puget Sound, were very opposed to the bridge, because what it would have done is created a very narrow sort of passage through which these boats would have had to go, or they would have had to go down Cobos Passage, which is a narrow, twisting kind of passage. So the shipping companies, the Port of Tacoma, Pilots Association, and then all of those interests on the Kitsap Peninsula who didn't want the bridge at Vashon but wanted it at Bainbridge, because Bainbridge was a much easier access to Bremerton and to the developing parts of the Kitsap Peninsula. And then all the legislature, not all of them, but most of the legislators in Eastern Washington, who have never been favorable to funding bridges or ferries. You know, so you had a fair amount of opposition to the bridge.
Well, speaking of opposition, those 3,000 people at the high school gym, I understand the fire department was called. Is
Yes.
that true?
Yeah.
What do you know about that?
Yeah, it was actually at Chautauqua Elementary School. And I was in the gymnasium there. And it was certainly exceeded the occupancy capacity of the building. And there were people outside. I mean, they had speakers going outside, but it was a pretty strong sort of representation by the island that they did not want a bridge, which, you know, 30 years earlier in 1950 with the flower show, there was not universal, but it was largely supported by islanders. So 30 years makes a huge difference.
Yeah. So we're curious, going back to the original proposal. So Cherberg was Rossellini's lieutenant governor?
Lieutenant governor. Mm-hmm.
Correct. So the Rossellini family has a vacation home on Vashon. And so what do we think the connection in there is? Do we know? Do we know the governor's stand on the issue?
No. Yeah, I'm trying to recall. I think Rossellini was not a big proponent of the bridge, as I recall, but was not a major player in that legislation, as I understand it. You know, I think his ownership of property on Vashon Island made him sort of step back, not like some current politicians, but I mean, there was a code of honor at the time where I think he stepped back from heavy involvement because of his ownership of property on the island.
Great. Okay.
Okay, thanks, Liz and Bruce.
Pleasure.
So people have asked the question, are these talks recorded? And they are. And so you can see our past talks that are already on our website. And this one will be up on our website by early next week.
Mm-hmm.
And let's see, do you see any more talks or questions coming in? No, I don't think so. So if there's no more questions, thank you so much. This was great.
Good. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Liz. And thank you, Elsa. Appreciate it
Thank
very
you.
much. Mhm.
Bye.